And the trouble is with doctors is they tell you, oh, you're going to have this and you're going to have this and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. Step back from that. You have to step back from what the doctors tell you. They told me basically that I had a cancer. The way it was working, it was literally eating me alive. And I sort of looked at them and thought, but why would my body do this to me? It is literally, why would my body do this to me? What is it trying to communicate? And it was only when I started to think about, well, if you look at the symptoms and if you look at, I'm actually feeling as though I was being eaten alive. Well, that relationship, my marriage, made me feel as though I was being eaten alive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip That Shit. I am your host, Stacey Uhrig, and my guest for the second time joining us is Karen Bashford, all the way from England. I'm right outside of New York City in New Jersey. And I chose to have Karen come back because our first episode was so impactful, so enlightening. I got so much good feedback on it. And as we were rounding out our last podcast, which I'll link in the show notes, we really started to talk about how adverse childhood experiences can actually play a role in your physical health. And her and I both know this from personal experiences of our own diagnoses, but we also know this from working with other people who have also had adverse childhood experiences, how it affects their health. This is a really big topic. It's been talked about a lot lately. Gabor Mate, who is a medical doctor turned trauma godfather, just wrote a book called The Myth of Normal, which really talks a lot about how abnormal our society is and how this toxicity is showing up, physically manifesting in people. If you didn't see the first episode, so Karen is on a mission to stop abuse and trauma from being passed on to future generations. This is where we connect well. At 50, Karen realized her parents had actually never told her that they loved her or had even hugged her. It was normal as far as she was concerned, but explained why she had attracted two abusive relationships in her life. You seek the kind of love you know, she says. Due to their dysfunctional nature with her parents, both abusive partners were emotionally disconnected. When she finally divorced from her husband, Karen lacked confidence, was emotionally exhausted with no money or work, and had a life-threatening illness, which is what we're going to talk about today. Her quest to understand why she had two abusive relationships, had lost her home twice, and experienced life-threatening disease led her to seek answers. In finding the answers, Karen now uses her knowledge and wisdom as a psychic, an energy healer, hypnotherapist, again, nice commonality there, and she's an NLP practitioner who helps other women heal from their own chronic pain and disease. You can always learn more about Karen at her website, which is themanifestinglady.com. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you here today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. But I don't really want to talk about my diagnosis. I want to learn more about what this life-threatening disease was that you had and where you saw the tie into some of the trauma you experienced early on.
Okay, well, the actual disease is an autoimmune disease called Langerhans Cellosis. And children of age 4 would normally get it, and the prognosis is by 10, they're usually dead.
Wow. And what does the disease, how does it present?
It presents in your body actually attacks itself. So your white cells do not recognize that you don't have germs. Because you wouldn't normally have germs in a bone unless it's been broken. Obviously, you might have germs in your lungs, but generally, most places, you don't have germs. So your body doesn't produce white cells to attack those germs. Mm-hmm. My body literally produced so many white cells that it was started to attack itself. So I had it in my bones, I had it in my lungs, I had it in my vagina. They're the ones I know about, simply because I was starting to get a lot of pain. I couldn't breathe. And I also seemed to have constant irritation in my vagina.
How old were you when you actually received the diagnosis?
I was 40.
Okay. And how long did it take, and how many doctors did you have to go through in order to get that diagnosis?
I was seeing my doctor probably every other week because it impacted my breathing terribly. They finally referred me to the hospital for a biopsy. Luckily, the lab assistant who checked it had actually seen the disease before and was able to give the prognosis, or informed us what it was. Having said that, nobody knew about it prior to then. They could not tell me what it was. They kept telling me I had herpes.
They kept telling you had herpes?
Yeah, sexual herpes. And I knew I didn't. I just knew I didn't. So yeah, 2 years of trying to find out what it was, having it diagnosed.
Yeah. And the reason why I asked about the timing is because it's not uncommon, especially when you're dealing with these very rare autoimmune diseases. A couple of things happen. Number one, you know for sure there's something very wrong. You know for sure your body is not acting normally. There can be a lot of medical gaslighting happening, meaning people will try to tell you that you're crazy and that actually what you're experiencing, you're not, which is really such a mind fuck for the person because they know they're not okay. And just because a medical doctor can't figure it out doesn't necessarily mean that they're right? We're seeing this more and more. Again, part of this Myth of Normal book by Gabor Mate is the fact that our medical community is not trauma informed. They're looking at the symptoms. They're not looking at the root cause. Right? So we have this scenario, and I'm just going to say this because we're live. I can hear my dogs going crazy upstairs. So hopefully when we're editing this video and this audio, we won't hear them. But they are who they are.
I've just switched my light on.
Oh my gosh!
I've just switched my light on, right? So you can see
this is about content. This is about the quality of the content, not the perfection of the output. This is what I will always say. But, this is such an important thing. And we're going to put the name of the disease again in the show notes. Can you just say the name of the disease again that you were diagnosed with?
Yes, it's Langerhans Cellosis. Langerhans is the gentleman who discovered it.
Okay. So, when you and I first spoke, it was not lost on me that you told me that you were diagnosed in your 40s, but that this is generally something that is diagnosed when someone is under the age of 5 years old. The reason why that struck me is because I also knew that you had quite a bit of developmental trauma. And the thing that I was curious about, and I don't know what your thoughts are on it, is it possible that this particular disease presented, how do I put this? If this is normally a disease that presents at 4 years old, and you have feelings and emotions that have not been resolved yet, is it possible that they ended up showing up at the time when you were getting ready to resolve them, and now they were kind of almost being dealt with in that moment? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I totally agree with you. I am very conscious of all the illnesses I've had. They show up when the situation is starting to be resolved.
Yeah. Can we
which
talk a
meant
little
I
bit
was
about that?
leaving my
'Cause I
husband.
think you were leaving your husband.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here you are, you're leaving your husband, you're starting to resolve within yourself. This is the first marriage or the second marriage?
First marriage.
Okay, so you're starting to become more aware and more in tune with your particular early childhood challenges. All of a sudden, this very rare autoimmune disease that typically gets found at the age of 4 shows up in your system.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what you think about that. Tell me what struck you about that.
Well, I would add here that at the time, my father had just died. So I also think that has a lot to do with it, because obviously the trauma I'm talking about is my parents not expressing love by touch or by expressing the words. Don't get me wrong, I've said it before, they looked after me wonderfully well, but a human needs touch. I didn't get it. So part of the issue was my father had died. So it was like my body was going, I don't have to deal with this part of it. And then starting the proceedings to leave my husband, it was like, oh, I can get rid of this now. And yeah. I totally get that my body had held on and on and on. And as soon as it was able to release, it then produced the illness. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's about recognizing that your body communicates with you. And when it gets to that point that you can start releasing it, that's when the illnesses appear.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me, a couple of things. I love the fact that you're always really clear about the fact that your parents raised you well, right? They took care of you. They kept you safe. They met a lot of your vital needs, right? They kept you fed, hydrated, sheltered. But what people do not understand is that one of the most important things is connection. Right. And as an adoptive mom, when I was in the process of adopting my children, even what level of connection my children were having as infants was really important to me. Right. Because I knew how vital that was going to be to their success later on in life. So your parents met all of these needs, but there was one that was dramatically missed, if you will, which was this connection of you belong. I love you, even though it was clearly unconditional and you had it, it wasn't expressed, right? Which leaves the child questioning. What I want to talk about for a second is the generational trauma that's happening there, that intragenerational trauma, the familial trauma. My guess is your parents didn't meet and have this covert conversation on the side and be like, we're going to meet all of her needs, but we're actually going to never express love to her. This was likely something that they learned from their parents. And it was also something that their parents learned and their parents, the grandparents, the great grandparents. This clearly was a cyclical situation. How much do you know about, the way that your parents were raised or the way that your grandparents were raised?
My mother's family, her father was, he was a gentle gentleman, and he was loving in his own way, but he was prevented from loving my mother in a way that she would have learnt from him to be able to share with me and my siblings because of my grandmother. My grandmother was this person that was very narcissistic, everything had to be on her terms. Everything was, I'm the one that's ill. And she was genuinely ill. She had a heart condition from child. And everything focused on her. So she was very jealous of my mother and the attention my grandfather gave to my mother. So my mother basically had huge trauma herself. And having spoken to her about this, it is very, very clear that she recognizes it, but there was nothing she could do about it because obviously trauma isn't spoken about. But that generation. She's now 90 years old, so she didn't know very much about it. Going beyond that, I do know there was a lot of siblings on both sides of the family for my grandmother and grandfather. They lost a lot of them during the wars. And that had a huge impact, because the ones that really, from my conversations, that really were able to demonstrate love died. So that's my mother's side. On my
so let's just talk
side,
about that side first, because that's super loaded. Yeah. Can we talk about your mom's side first? Because I don't want to forget this, and then we're going to get to your dad's side. There's a couple of things that I want the listeners to understand when we talk about trauma. Trauma does not have to be abuse or aggression or violence. It also doesn't have to be war, though this is an example where war came in, but in a different way. Trauma can be anything that leaves you feeling unseen, unheard, unimportant, insignificant, therefore unworthy, undeserving of love, not enough. It's never the event. It's how it leaves you feeling. So if there was no, and I'm going to put in quotes, abuse in the household, but yet there was a parent that she was seeking deep connection from, really two parents, it's very impossible to have a deep meaning connection with a narcissist because everything's about them. Mm-hmm. And then when you have another parent that's trying to please the narcissist, and part of pleasing the narcissist is making the narcissist number one and making everybody else in the family a piece of shit. When you're a young child, before your rational brain is developed, you're going to start making agreements about what that looks like. They're not connecting with me because there's something wrong with me. Mm-hmm. Right? They can't look at that situation and go, well, my mother has this issue and my dad is just trying to please her and it's not about me. You don't even have your rational brain developed in order to make that decision. So now you're in this and you've created this lens and this filter through which to see yourself, connect with others and the world around you. That can be traumatic to the system, and it's a relational abuse, if you will, right? From a developmental perspective. And so what people don't understand is that then easily gets carried over from generation to generation until people like Karen and I say, no, it stops here. We're going to be the cycle breakers. We want different. We don't want this for the future generations in our family. So we know this. And also just to say what you were sharing about with the war, even if the people that were the most loving were the ones that passed, there's also this concept of it's just too painful to love. Because every time I've loved these people, I've lost them due to war, disease, whatever. And so very quickly, we start to create this agreement with ourselves that is, when I love, I get hurt. In order to protect myself from getting hurt, I'm just going to cut off the love. And I experienced that personally with my stepmother. You know, my dad and my stepmom were married, I'm going to guess 33, 34 years. She had lost 2 children before she married my father. She had 2 children from her first marriage, which was an abusive first marriage. Her first daughter, she had at the age of 18 and was born with Down syndrome. And her daughter had a hole in her heart, which is not uncommon at the time. And she ended up dying at the age of 13. And because they told my stepmother that she was going to lose her daughter, she got pregnant right away. And her kids were like 10 or 11 months apart. So the daughter dies when she's 13. And then she has this intensely amazing relationship with her son, right? Because it just brought them even closer together. And then he ends up with leukemia and dies before he's 21 years old. And I think my father thought this is going to be great for my stepmother because this is going to bring children back into her life. At the time, my brother and I were 7 and 11. But really, in retrospect, what became very clear very quickly is she had no interest in having a relationship with us. It wasn't until I was in my 40s, so we're talking over 30 years of trying to hustle for her affection and her approval and her love, that it became clear to me she was never going to be able to do that because that was just going to be way too vulnerable. She had adopted the agreement, if I get close to people, I will get hurt and I can't bear that pain anymore. And so I just won't do it. And so understanding that gave me great relief because I spent 30 years thinking it was me. Right?
Yes,
So
I can fully understand that.
I can see that. So we know what happened on your mom's side, which would have been brutal enough. Tell us about your dad's side.
My dad's parents were ill a lot of the time. They were very, very overweight. I don't know much about their history other than the fact that I got the impression they were very narcissistic. How two people got together and become narcissistic together, I don't know. But my father certainly had a really rough childhood. And even as an adult married to my mother, they dominated him. My mother didn't have much say when they put their foot down and said no. They were intending to move to New Zealand, and his parents categorically said, no, you can't go. You've got to stay and support us. So that's the kind of relationship my father had. He was a gentleman who lacked confidence. Although he was very, very intelligent, he didn't use that intelligence as much as he could have done. He hated any kind of conflict and he hated any kind of responsibility.
Isn't it interesting? Your dad was a good person, but he just didn't know how to love.
Yeah.
As a child. So
my parents got together.
Yeah, but here's what's so fascinating. So, I've worked with a handful of clients that it was just very, very clear to me that their childhood was very dysfunctional, but they refused to accept that notion because it was very normal for their culture or it was very normal for their environment. Right? So if you grew up in an area, say, of New York City, we have all these different boroughs and a lot of them are kind of, there's a lot of, people who have immigrated from all over the world that kind of create these pockets of these sections of these areas. And there's a part kind of off of Queens where it's a highly, a lot of people immigrated from Italy and Ireland way back in the day. And this is just where everybody settled. And I had a client who was from an area like that. And generationally, all the families just kind of raised their children the same way. It was deeply Irish area. And everybody was able to easily point back to when a family member came over from Ireland. And it wasn't uncommon to rear by physical punishment. And so even though my client and these siblings were constantly in fear of being hit and abused, the concept was I had a great childhood and that's just the way everybody was raised. And this is kind of where I think Gabor Mate tries to go with this myth of normal. Because she loved her parents, understandably so. She didn't want to admit that there had been abuse because that would have been then her saying something negative about her parents. Her parents were likely doing the best that they knew how to do, given their own traumas.
Agree with that one.
Right? Given their own traumas, their own past experiences, they were literally doing the best they could do and maybe even better than they had been raised. But it may have not been good enough in the sense that there were still things happening that were not functional to the family. So I can tell that your dad was doing the best he knew how to do.
Yes.
Right? And even your mom was doing the best that she knew how to do. This is where I think our generation is a group of cycle breakers, because we're like, no, it can actually be done better and I'm willing to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So you come out of this dysfunctional situation, even though it's your normal, you're not aware that it's not normal to not be affectionate with your parents or to receive affection. It ends up bringing you into these different toxic relationships. Toxically, it takes over your system. How do you resolve that? Would you say that your illness is in remission?
No, because as soon as acknowledging that I was responsible for my choices, because they are my choices, even though I chose the wrong partners, I made the choice.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to realize that the actual illnesses I'd been experiencing, because I'd had ones previous to that, when I started to realize that I was responsible for ignoring the warning signs, I actually started to make changes to myself and my body, in the sense of, it was like, I'm not putting up with this. This isn't going to keep going. I'm going to do something about it. And even though I was under hospital care, I didn't finish it, because unfortunately they treat it as a cancer. So they give you chemotherapy. And I refused point blank to have chemotherapy. Wasn't going to put that in my body at all. So we had an agreement that I would try antibiotics as a means to get my body to recognize that it didn't have all these germs, which was fine. The only trouble is, for a week, I took 800 milligrams of antibiotics instead of 200. So it actually poisoned my body. And it was at that point that I turned around and said, no, I'd much rather just die of this than have you treat me anymore. So I walked away. That's when I started things like aromatherapy, hypnotherapy, reflexology, you name it. I researched it. I did it. But I also believe very much that when you acknowledge what's going on, your body starts to heal itself anyway.
Because I 100% agree.
After the initial reaction to the drugs, I then had to relearn how to eat, because there was foods that I couldn't eat. That I still can't take any drugs. No drugs at all. As soon as I put any kind of drugs, whether they're over-the-counter drugs or whether they're prescribed, I can't take them. My body literally stops me taking them. So I had to learn how to manage my body again, food-wise and everything else. And I class it as a blessing.
Yeah, I understand that. And so I received a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis in 2020, October of 2020. And I was riddled with pain, inflammation, extreme fatigue for about 6 months leading up to that diagnosis. It took about 6 months, which I think is relatively quick.
Yes.
I was also offered medication that I wasn't comfortable with. And I asked my doctor, I said two things. Number one, while I was still in her office, I actually looked up the correlation between ACEs, which is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and rheumatoid arthritis. And based on a score, there's a scoring system for the ACEs scale. I was like 80% chance likely that I was going to have some sort of inflammatory related autoimmune disease because of the childhood experiences I had had. You know, when you go through the stress, this is what happens when you go through this deep stress of not feeling enough or being in a constant state of fight or flight, which is where I felt I was from the age of, say, 11 to 21, your body will become inflamed. And unless you're ready to let go of those experiences, it can manifest. So I quickly said to the doctor, can we just have an agreement? I'm not going to take the steroids. I don't want to take that yet. I want to try to do some emotional healing first. She looked at me like I had 6 heads. I asked her if she knew about the ACEs score. She said, I've heard about it, but I really don't know much about it. Now, this is a rheumatologist, and we both know, Karen, how much autoimmune is associated with these kinds of stresses as a young child. I took the approach of food as well. I took anything that was extra inflammatory out of my diet, and I started with an intense protocol of acupuncture. I wanted a lot of cupping. I wanted a lot of acupuncture. I literally wanted to move things through my system, and I wanted to suck the toxins out of my muscle. And it was just like you said, the awareness and the acceptance. There was a pivotal moment when I was on the table and my entire back was cupped. And if you've ever had cupping, you'll know it's a very intense sensation at the beginning, especially if you have a lot of things that need to be sucked out. The sensation is very tight, very uncomfortable, very agitating, right? And what I love about my acupuncturist is her cups are in the shape of hearts. So I was envisioning all these hearts down my back, and it was so uncomfortable because my entire back was covered. And I remember sitting to myself and saying, okay, don't tell yourself this hurts. Don't create a story around this discomfort. Just sit with it. And if I don't create a story with it, this discomfort is going to dissipate quicker, right? Because the more power we give to it, the more thought we give to it. As the moment I did that and I surrendered and I let into that, there was an experience that I had where I recognized in that moment what I was doing for my body. And that part of my trauma as a young child was feeling alone in a very stressful experience that lasted a full decade. And I had this moment where I recognized I actually was never alone. My body was always with me. My body took in all of the stress with me and for me. And this is why it was so broken, because it had hit its limit. And now I was going to love it back to health. And I burst into tears. It was literally an epiphany. I burst into tears. And I just started saying to myself, I love you, I love you, I love you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Because in that moment, I realized the reason why my body was so inflamed enough to register and show up as rheumatoid arthritis was because it had taken on everything for me at a time when I couldn't do it for myself. I was so young. Right? Yeah. So I took that approach and I stayed with that approach for a year. And I got my numbers from a 10 on a scale of anything above a 3 is considered inflammatory. I was at a 10 and I got it down to a 2.7. And I never took a drug. And I will say I'm not against drugs and I can easily take drugs. But I knew in my heart of hearts, all I was going to be masking was the work I actually needed to do to get to the next level of my healing journey. And that was what I like to work with my clients. Say again?
I said that makes total sense, because I know as soon as I acknowledged that, yes, my body was complaining at me, because I'd chosen to ignore all the warning signs. I was being informed psychically or intuitively that I needed to get out, but I wasn't getting out. I was still tolerating the relationship. So it was hardly surprising my body then turned around and said, well, you're out of it now, so I can just let go of this. So, yeah.
And I think for me, I had breadcrumbs too. And for me, those breadcrumbs, it was 20 years of anxiety where I never, and it's not that I didn't try to approach the anxiety. I started therapy when I was 15 years old, and I did therapy into my mid 30s. But it wasn't really mitigating the anxiety, because I think at that time, you're talking about the 80s and the early 90s, early 2000s, our medical professionals, even our psychologists and our psychiatrists, were not trauma informed. They were treating what was right in front of you in that moment. Nobody was asking me about my lived experience up to that point. I mean, they had an understanding, but in their mind, I was released from therapists on more than one occasion because they literally said to me, there's nothing I can do for you. You get it. You'll be fine. It's just that your nervous system's out of whack, so you must take this medication. But it wasn't. Every time I would stop the medication, it would come right back up because it wasn't dealt with. So we could talk about this forever. What I want to know from you, because I want my listeners to hear this, is when you're working with your clients, and you do work with clients that are coming to you with autoimmune, rare disease, and you know that this is related to a lived experience prior, what kind of illnesses and disease are you seeing? Because if I have a listener that is listening today that this is resonating with, and you can start listing some conditions and they have that, I think it's going to be a true aha moment for someone.
Okay, so medical anxiety, cancers, a range of autoimmunes, arthritis. It's interesting because I tend not to take on board what they say their illnesses are.
I do the same thing. Go ahead.
I tend to just listen to what they're saying, and it's like, that's judgment. That's rejection. Oh my God. The whole family abandoned them. Or mum told you that I wanted to abort you, but I couldn't. No wonder you've got all these diseases. So I do obviously take on board what the diseases are, but it's more a case of the underlying beliefs, the issues, the behaviors, and everything else that makes that person up to who they are. That's what I'm interested in. The disease is irrelevant. It's what they are living in at that present time. That
it's so interesting.
Made up from all their past.
I was happy to have a diagnosis when I received the news of rheumatoid arthritis. And I want people to be really clear. I'm being incredibly intentional by not saying I have rheumatoid arthritis. I will rarely say it unless I slip and I'm not being mindful, but you will not hear me say that, because the moment we take ownership of something, unless we release it, it sticks with us. So I'm always mindful to say I received a diagnosis of. Part of that was very validating for me. Like, I fucking knew I was not okay. And I needed an answer as to why. However, I never connected 100% with the terminology because I actually didn't believe it. And this is why. I knew I had enough inflammation in my system to register on a test that tests for rheumatoid arthritis. But that was it. Meaning, and I had all the symptoms, right? I had it very specifically in very specific joints. It's a very unique pain. I have it on the inside of my elbows, on the inside of my knees, on the inside of my ankles. The fatigue is like nothing else I've ever experienced other than when I've had COVID. Like, I had all the symptoms of it, but what I knew was it was not a symptom of rheumatoid arthritis. It was a symptom of the past. And so like you, and this is why I giggled when you said it, when a client comes to me and they're battling whatever diagnosis they've received. I'm always on a mission to help them start to heal the emotional trauma that is presenting as that symptom. And I know what you were just describing, like, this is related to abandonment. This is related to rejection. For people that are curious about what we're talking about, there are a number of books. This is the one I reference the most. This one's called Feelings Buried Alive, Never Die. It's by Carol Trueman. And the idea behind this is that every single emotion that we have not resolved will manifest itself physically. Think about this. Feelings buried alive. So feelings that we have not processed and we literally have just buried them, never die. And at some point, they're going to come back up, as mine did. And trust me, there was some stressful shit. I was at a tipping point relationally with certain people in my family that were the original cause of my stress in childhood. It's no surprise that the rheumatoid came up when it did, right? Just like it was no surprise that you were diagnosed with a rare disease that people only get when they're 4, when you were 40, because the things that you needed to address were what was coming up to the apex. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think it's really important for people to understand, if you've received a diagnosis, no one's saying that you're not sick, and no one is saying that you're not riddled with whatever the condition is. But this is an opportunity to look at the condition through a little bit of a different lens. Could there be a component of this condition that could potentially be related to emotions we have not healed? And if I was working on those emotions simultaneously to all the other recommendations being made, could I find myself in more peace and less pain? Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. Totally. Yeah. If you don't, it's like people have the diagnosis of whatever it is, and it's automatically a label. And the trouble is with doctors is they tell you, oh, you're going to have this and you're going to have this and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. Step back from that. You have to step back from what the doctors tell you. They told me basically that I had a cancer. The way it was working, it was literally eating me alive. Yeah. And I sort of looked at them and thought, but why would my body do this to me?
Bingo.
It is literally, why would my body do this to me? What is it trying to communicate? And it was only when I started to think about, well, if you look at the symptoms and if you look at, I'm actually feeling as though I was being eaten alive. Well, that relationship, my marriage, made me feel as though I was being eaten alive.
It's very powerful.
It was so obvious when you really start to look at what that illness is and not look at the symptoms or the potential of what the doctors tell you. You can find so much in just acknowledging that, why have I got this illness?
Oh my
and
God.
Like you, I would not acknowledge what it was. I refused point blank to even talk about it. As far as I'm concerned, it had a name. That name was whatever I talked about. I never talked about, I had an autoimmune.
I would say I'm challenged with rheumatoid symptoms. Right? Because it's really what people can understand.
Yeah, I just simply said, I have Langerhans Cellosis. What does that mean? Because it meant absolutely nothing to me unless I actually went and investigated it.
people do hold on to the certainty of the diagnosis. And there's also a tremendous amount of trust that's put into the medical professional. But again, it's really important for people to understand. They do not talk about how emotions connect. We talk about this mind-body connection. But up to this point, most of the medical professionals you're going to see, maybe it's changing now, but the people that are practicing doctors, they've not been trained. I have a nephew right now that's pre-med. There's none of that happening. We're talking about biology, chemistry, we're talking about symptomology, but they're not getting to the root cause from an emotional body, mind, spirit connection. So we talked about, I love to give book resources because I know, Karen, you're a coach. I'm a coach. I know when I was in my worst shape, I actually didn't have money for a coach and I had to save and save and save for the person I wanted to work with in order to do healing even well before that diagnosis. But what I used as no and low cost resources were books, podcasts, YouTube videos. There's so much out there, right? It's one of the reasons I do my podcast now. So I wanted people to walk away with a couple of different resources that kind of line up with what we've been discussing today. And if you have extras to add, that would be awesome. This one's called Feelings Buried Alive, Never Die. It's by Carol Trueman, and it's Carol with a K. Carol K. Trueman. Excellent resource. I use this book all the time with my clients. Even if they're coming to me with a sty in their eye or hip pain, it can be used for anything. The other one is a pretty meaty book, and it's pretty thick, as you can see, but this is called The Myth of Normal. It's Gabor Mate's newest book. Gabor Mate is a medical doctor. He has written many books. This is his latest, and the subtitle of it is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. What I love about him is he is a medical doctor who ended up leaving the profession because he was so frustrated by the lack of trauma information within the medical community. And his specialty is actually understanding addiction and how, our experiences and our emotions lead to that. And the last book, this is an oldie but a goodie. This is called The Body Keeps Score. It's a New York Times bestseller. The subtitle is Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. The author is Bessel van der Kolk, also a medical doctor. He was trained psychiatrist who called bullshit. And again, I don't disbelieve in psychiatry. We have a psychiatrist that we have certain people in my family that we see. I don't think that there's anything wrong with needing a psychiatrist, but I think it's important to do your due diligence and simultaneously be looking at some of the root causes for the symptoms that we're medicating all the time. So those are my 3 recommendations. Body Keeps the Score, The Myth of Normal, and Feelings Buried Alive, Never Die. What do you have, Karen?
Well, I have a beautiful one called Your Body's Telling You, Love Yourself.
Love that.
So it's back to front on the thing. It's Lisa Bourbeau. She has 20 years when this was written. I don't know when it was written. Of research in the field of metaphysics, and is a physical manifestation, and it's physical manifestations in the body. Brilliant book. You literally can look up so many things in it and find the emotional blocks and what they're likely to have caused them. So that's a brilliant one.
Can you tell the name of that one again?
It's Your Body's Telling You, Love Yourself.
Your body is telling you, love yourself. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And the other one is The Emotional Code.
Oh, yeah.
And it's Bradley Nelson. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, because you can use this to find where in your body and what the emotions are that you're likely to be holding on to.
Yeah, I have a coach that I work with.
You don't even have to. Yeah. You don't even have to have knowledge of an illness or anything, but just asking the questions, you can come up with so many answers.
Yeah. I have a few friends that are trained in the emotion code, and one of my own coaches, coaches have their own cadre and their own village of their own healers. And one of the coaches that I work with on and off, we've done that many times where she's helping me seek answers internally. It's pretty amazing to watch. You have to be very intuitive, which I know that you are, Karen, to really feel that. But it's pretty incredible. Listen, we're at the 50-minute mark. I could talk about this forever. I think really what I wanted people to be able to walk away from is this. If you are diseased, right? Meaning you're feeling sick, you have chronic pain, you maybe have received a diagnosis, or in some cases, many diagnoses, where you just feel very broken and that your body is not your own. I would implore you to add into what you're doing. Maybe you're taking medication, maybe you're in different kinds of physical therapies for whatever you're dealing with. I would implore you to take another lens to look at it. You don't have to leave any lens that you're doing. This is not an either or, it's an and. Get curious. Talk to someone. Reach out to somebody like myself or Karen who understands how emotions are tied to physical manifestations in the body, and start doing your research. Grab one of these books. Start to see if any of it resonates. Use the internet a little bit. Start searching things like ACEs and whatever condition you've been challenged with. Getting to the root from an emotional standpoint could yield really beautiful results for you in maybe a quicker way. I'll end with this. And one of the reasons why we're ending early is because I have to run to a meeting in which this gal will be. But I had a horrible pain in my shoulder from April to September. And the pain was so excruciating. I couldn't even lift my arm. And I did all the things. I went to physical therapy. I saw an orthopedist. I had x-rays done. I had a CAT scan done. I was doing deep tissue massage. I was doing myofascial release, all of which was excruciatingly painful. And I was deeply going through emotionally some very, very, very challenging emotions of helplessness, despair, grief, of things I haven't really fully dealt with that are 30 plus years old. And it was not getting better. So I was telling another one of my friends who's a medium, very intuitive, that I'm at a loss. My quality of life was not good. She said I should go to my friend Arti Argawal. And Arti's amazing. She's probably the most intuitive person I've ever met. She also does hypnotherapy, but she does something called quantum healing hypnosis technique, which I've done with her. But she uses another technique by a guy named Brandon Bay. Are you familiar with this? Where
Yes.
she does this deep hypnosis and takes you on a journey within your body to the point of pain. And I can't even describe all that happened. I just remember being around a campfire with my grandmother and my grandfather and my mother, and all these emotions were coming up. And it was this really unique, crazy, wacky experience. But I was down for it because I was in so much pain. Within 6 weeks, not only was all the pain gone, literally gone, but my range of motion was, I would say, 85% back. I went through deep, excruciating physical therapy and myofascial release for 6 months, and nothing was working. And I just said, let me take this additional approach. I dropped everything at that moment because I wanted to isolate it and see, and it was the only thing that worked. So I leave you guys with that because I know it sounds woo-woo. Well, we will use that word. But I am firsthand experience, I can tell you, dealing with the emotional core of so many of our ailments is one of the best ways to heal. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Karen, thank you for giving us your time today.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
I really have loved it. You guys can find all of our podcasts from Flip That Shit, all of the episodes, wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks so much for sticking with us through this entire episode. We appreciate it, and you'll hear from us again soon.